During your tenure at CBS, you were there for a lot of big events, 9/11, 3 presidential elections. How do you cover each story differently so that you make sure you're getting the point across for each different story?
They're quite different. 9/11 was an unexpected, cataclysmic story, so you scramble. We had excellent people there, they still do. So it was pretty clear quite early that morning that something very untoward was happening. So we kept the morning program on the air and then eventually switched over to the evening team, but we just stayed live from that Tuesday morning all the way till Saturday. That's not business as usual. So what you do is you scramble everybody. In the case of CBS News, it's a fairly lean operation, and it means the people doing the primetime programs came in to work in the evening, and we were on the air obviously at night as well, and it was all hands on deck. So that was really unique in my experience. The biggest story I've been involved with. I thought all the networks did a superb job. It's a good example of where network news can play a unique role in not just informing the country, but uniting the country around a common experience, as horrible and traumatic as that experience was. And that extended, of course, to the investigation. Of course, there was a war afterwards, the mourning period. That story continues to reverberate. But that was, I hope, once in a lifetime. Yeah. Elections are different because there's a tremendous amount of planning. There's a playbook, a set of templates that you follow, and obviously the players change, but the events have been the same for a long time. That said, it doesn't mean they're easy. As you know, all the networks famously screwed up in 2000, the Bush-Gore election, and miscalled it, ended up having to end the night without knowing who was going to be the next president, and that dragged on for weeks. So you couldn't plan for that, or at least we didn't, and that was an embarrassing moment. The new presidents had to eventually testify in Congress about it. But generally, there's a well-established protocol with experienced people, and believe me, there's a ton of planning going on now for the 2020 race.
Yeah. You spoke about how after 9/11, the country was unified. They came together. Today, we're not really that unified in our political climate. And we have a president who often refers to the media as the enemy of the people. How important do you think that newscasts and news anchors and journalism is in a time where the president is constantly criticizing them?
Well, you could argue that they're even more important, but they've been important for a very long time. The role of any one news organization has diminished over time with the fragmentation of the news audience. There's fragmentation on the supply side and the demand side. I don't mean to sound like a professor spewing economic jargon, but on the supply side, there are many more sources of news, so any one source is not as influential. You're never going to have a network anchor be the most trusted man in America, as Walter Cronkite was called, or even Uncle Walter, the way he was also called. And out of the demand side, people have many different ways to get news, so they're not going to cluster around the set at a given time in the same numbers that they did. That said, the institution of free and fair news institutions who report without fear or favor has always been a linchpin of democracy, and I would argue those institutions are even more important at a time when the free press is being demonized and polarized in a very toxic political environment.
Mm-hmm. As a former news president at CBS, you know that the millennial generations are shifting away from that 30-minute 6 o'clock newscast at the end of the night. Do you think that the news channels need to adapt more to the millennial generation? Or do you think that there will be a comeback and the millennial generation, as they get older, will come back to those newscasts and realize the importance of them?
There's not too much evidence that people are going to come back to consume them in their current form. A couple of nuances there. The evening newscasts are still very popular. They still attract, the 3 broadcast networks attract between 20 and 25 million people a night combined. It's a big number. If you think of it as one show, that's a giant hit by today's standards. But it's not what it was. It used to be, to your point, James, that people would take on their parents' news habits as they got older. That just isn't true anymore. There's just too many other ways to go. You're part of a media-savvy generation that is unlikely to gravitate to a regular, what they call linear news habit, meaning a program that just unfolds over time in a way that you don't control in any way. So I do think that as people get older and as they start paying taxes and caring about mortgages and school quality and so on, their need for news increases, although young people are very interested in news now, and they're interested in a lot of issues that are undercovered. We can talk about that if you want to. But it's not clear that they're going to gravitate to a network newscast. That said, people have been predicting the death of the evening newscast for a long time. They still perform an interesting function. So I think they will evolve to some degree, and the stories within them will become units of currency, if you will, that can be shared on other platforms or forms of those stories. So the reporting that goes into them can take other forms that will be more viable for the next generation. But I think for the foreseeable future, we'll still have 3 newscasts that look the way they do. But they have been eroding steadily for decades. And even though there have been periods of relative stability, I think over time, they will evolve somewhat, but people will also move to other forms of consuming national and international news.
Those uncovered stories that you speak about, if the newscasts were to cover them, do you think that the millennial generations will come back and they'll gain those younger viewers?
It's, a lot would have to change. It's a great question. I don't have a great answer. I think a perfect example is climate, which has been undercovered. I think that's changing now. This is a year when there's a growing awareness of climate change, but I don't think that's been covered adequately, and that's something that young people care about a lot. They're the ones that are going to inherit the mess that our generations have made for them, so it's understandable that they care. So I think newscasts will expand the ambit of their story selection, their storytelling. I hope they don't do it in a way that's an attempt to pander to young people, because that isn't going to work. But if they moved a little bit away from inside the Beltway, a little bit more towards real issues that affect communities and how people live, I think that at least their decline will slow, and they may attract some new people. It's really, a lot depends on, how clever they are about it and how good they are at moving their stories onto over-the-top platforms, social media platforms. So even if an anchor person in 24 minutes after you take away the commercials summarizing the world may seem archaic and arcane, but the reporting within that still has value. And I think there's a chance that young people, if those reports continue to evolve in a way that's interesting and that really fills a need, I think that young people will consume them, but probably not at 6:30 at night in front of a TV set.
Yeah. We see social media as a really big thing in the internet, and you were at CBS when you were news president at a time when the internet was in its prime of just getting started, and you made a risk in your career and pretty much as CBS to jump into the internet stage. You were kind of at the forefront. What made you take that risk and push you when other places were saying, you know what, we don't need to waste money in this?
I don't want to pat myself on the back to sprain my arm doing so, but it was fairly obvious that we had to be involved with this very exciting and important new way of sharing information. Social media didn't exist yet, really, but as you say, the internet was coming into its own. And you make a good point. There was resistance to it. Why are we spending money on this? It's not, and there was also cultural resistance within the institution. People who, and still there, I don't feel original digital storytelling has fully come into its own this many years later. So I think there's still a lot of work to be done. But I think we were right to invest. I think there's very aggressive investment now. CBS has aggressively moved into over-the-top 24-hour streaming, not just nationally, but local stations in New York and LA are now doing it, which is great. But there's still a long way to go. It took too long, and there's still a big problem figuring out the revenue models that are going to sustain news the way traditional revenue models, especially advertising, did for so many years.
How important do you think it is to take those risks and those jumps? We have a young student body here at Montclair State that wants to get into the journalism area. Do you think it's important to take those news risks?
I think it's critically important, and there isn't enough of it. It's easier said than done. There is an interesting and important tension between the now and the next, between maintaining the business you have, between serving people who are expecting certain things from you. We're not reporting, broadcasting into a vacuum. So you can't just throw all that out and say we're going to try something crazy, because people come to you for a vital service, which is news information that helps them live their lives in a more informed way. you have to balance that against the need to spot new technologies and experiment with them, new opportunities, like what the internet was decades ago. But there's much less innovation in broadcast journalism and in journalism in general than there should be. That's an area that I'm interested in now because I think encouraging it is going to be vital for its survival.
You're working at Arizona State University with Walter Cronkite School of Journalism there. In what ways are you shaping the future of media in your work there?
So I'm part of a project which is called the Knight Cronkite News Labs, funded by the Knight Foundation, and it's focused entirely on local TV news. And the reasoning behind it is that local television news is still profitable, often comes up in surveys as the most popular and the most trusted news source, so it's very influential. And yet in many communities it's become formulaic, familiar, somewhat stale. It's been too easy to make money, and therefore it hasn't had to dig deep into communities to truly serve them, in my view, although this is, I'm not there to be a harsh critic of local TV news. I think it's got fantastic potential. So the idea is that local television news has not figured out a way to resonate with your generation. So what can stations do, not just on television, but particularly on digital platforms, to connect with the news consumers of the future? So we have a project built around that. There's a research piece that I'm leading, which is figuring out what interesting things are going on that we should be sharing with the industry. Then there's a transformation process that a small number of stations are going through together, led by a group of consultants, and that's kind of small, limited by nature. And then there's an interesting piece, which is a set of experiments that a professor of practice in the newsroom is doing with students to try crazy things that stations can't try for themselves.
Thank you so much for coming on with us today.